Now that we've addressed some of the broader biome scale factors that influence the distribution of vegetation across the landscape, let's examine the process of forest classification at a finer scale. The process of forest management begins with the grouping of similar areas of forest land together into what we call stands. We will discuss stand delineation, the process of stand delineation, in greater detail later in the course, but this lecture provides a really good opportunity to look at forest classification at the stand level or management level. The process of classifying forest land by what we call cover type or also natural community involves assessing the most dominant canopy vegetation within an area, as well as the understory vegetation and ground cover that's present. The relative abundance of different species within our forest land is determined largely by site. That term site can be defined as the total environment of a particular forest area, not only determined by the broad climatic factors, but also determined by more local factors like topography and soil type. So if the process of forest management begins with classifying stands based on vegetation and site, you can think of cover types and natural communities as ways of defining and naming those areas or those stands. Cover types have traditionally been utilized by foresters as a way of naming and describing stands based only on canopy vegetation. Natural community definitions include canopy vegetation, but also understory vegetation, ground cover, topographic position, and natural disturbance regime as a means of defining an area ecologically. Though a little more complicated to utilize as a classification system, natural community definitions provide a much more informative and robust method of describing an area of forest land. So that is what we will focus on for the last several slides here. This slide here displays the natural community types of roughly 850-acre portion of DuPont State Forest in western North Carolina. From the map, you can see that the majority of the area, as represented by that orange color, falls within what we call the montane oak hickory natural community. These areas are upland forest areas that contain a varying mix of scarlet oak and white oak and black oak, pignut hickory, and other associated species like sourwood and black gum on relatively dry but productive slopes and ridges. By contrast, the yellow area, it's sort of in the northern portion of the map there, represents an acidic cove forest community dominated by yellow poplar in a sheltered, north-facing, moisture and nutrient-rich landscape position. The goal of forest classification at the site scale, utilizing natural community descriptions, is to recognize the ecological components and processes of an area so that we can manage them appropriately. The remaining few slides here will compare and contrast some common natural communities. Natural communities are distributed across the landscape based on the relative amount of sunlight, moisture, and soil nutrients provided by an area. Here's an example of the Rich Cove Forest natural community here in Haywood County. We can define this area as Rich Cove Forest based on all the ecological and site characteristics discussed earlier. Based on this classification, we can begin to analyze how our management activities will influence things like tree species composition and wildlife habitat. This is an example of the montane oak hickory forest that was mentioned earlier. We will contrast this community with the Rich Cove Forest in a moment. But it's important to recognize that these two natural communities can exist in very close proximity. In fact, if you were standing in the woods where this slide was taken and proceed to walk downslope to the right of the image, you would find yourself within a Rich Cove Forest community. It's important for us as land managers to first be able to draw this distinction, but also to understand how they are different. So here we go. The Rich Cove Forest Community is found in sheltered landscape positions, while the Montane Oak Hickory Community is common along broad ridges or throughout southwest facing side slopes. The Cove Community provides more available soil moisture because the topography in the area lends itself to collecting water rather than shedding it. Think of a large bowl in the forest. Also, it receives less solar radiation and contains deeper soils. Because of these factors, this community supports the growth of tree species like yellow poplar, northern red oak, and Carolina silverbell. In contrast, the Oak Hickory community develops on convex landscape positions. Think about turning that bowl upside down in the forest. These communities are common on the top of the bowl, right, on the top of the ridge, and along the steep sides of it. Here, there is less moisture available, more solar radiation, especially where they have a south and southwest facing aspect, and therefore drier conditions. Here you find the species that we mentioned earlier, scarlet oak, black oak, pitch pine. These are fundamentally different communities which provide different ecological value, but they may occur side by side in the forest as local site conditions change. Because they are fundamentally different, they are managed in fundamentally different ways. For one more comparison, let's take a look first here at a high elevation community in western North Carolina. The Spruce Fir Natural Community in western North Carolina is one of the most ecologically unique and also ecologically threatened communities in the southern Appalachians, with much resemblance to the extensive spruce fir forests of New England and Atlantic Canada. In contrast, here's an example of the Pine Oak Heath community, common to exposed but not necessarily high elevation landscape positions in western North Carolina. So the difference here between these two communities and the difference in growing conditions has much to do with the differences in elevation. The spruce fir community, as mentioned earlier in North Carolina, is only found at an elevation of roughly 5,000 feet or above. Here the temperatures are much cooler throughout the year. Precipitation in the form of rain and snow is common, and soil moisture is abundant as a result. Species adapted to these conditions against species you would more likely encounter in New England, like red spruce, yellow birch, and sugar maple, are present. By contrast, the Pine Oak Heath community develops on exposed landscape positions, so think about sharp ridges and mountain peaks, but ridges and peaks that only reach 3,000 to 3,500 feet in elevation. Here conditions are pretty dry. The soil is generally shallow to bedrock. Pitch pine, table mountain pine, and post oak are characteristic of these areas. These Pine Oak Heath forests are the best examples of a fire-dependent ecosystem in the southern Appalachians. Of all the natural communities, it is in these exposed, dry landscape positions where natural fire ignitions are most likely to occur. So just to wrap it up here, forest classification at a variety of scales is the first step towards understanding how forest ecosystems function. Broad climatic factors influence biome distribution, and within those biomes, site-specific ecological factors influence the distribution of what we could define as natural communities. If we can effectively classify and describe forest land based on natural community, we then have the ability to manipulate forest ecosystems to meet our objectives in an ecologically appropriate and ecologically positive way.